And now back to our top story, Wayne Swan's stoush with mining magnates Clive Palmer, Andrew Forrest and Gina Rinehart. The Treasurer and Deputy Prime Minister joined me earlier from our Parliament House studio to discuss the day's events. Wayne Swan, thanks for being there.
Good to be with you.
Doesn't Australia owe a debt of gratitude to the likes of Clive Palmer, Gina Rinehart, Andrew Forrest for the wealth they've created for the country?
Well, the wealth that's created in the mining industry is very important for Australia, and what we want is a prosperous country. We've got a very big investment in mining. That's a pipeline of investment that is creating opportunity in Australia. The point I've been making is that there are a few people in this country, some of the billionaires you've just named, who are seeking to exert too much influence on the outcomes of that wealth creation. They get a very good reward for what they do, but this country needs to be concerned about where the fair go is going when people are spending large amounts of private cash to try and sabotage public policy.
You've said that the likes of Gina Rinehart, Clive Palmer and Andrew Forrest are a threat to democracy, but where is the evidence of that? What exactly do you mean?
Well, we have reached a sensible conclusion with the mining industry about the mining resource rent tax. What that means is that Australians will get fair value for the resources they own 100%. But we've seen this campaign conducted, particularly by a number of individuals, against that agreement. And the fact is they're seeking to cloak their self-interest in the national interest. What I've been saying is we have to be alive to what is happening here, because if we want to be the country of the fair go and we want to see the opportunities spread fairly from the opportunities that come from the mining boom, then we have to be awake to the tactics of people, particularly like Mr Palmer.
The Australian people are quite aware of what's going on, aren't they? I mean, it's called robust debate, isn't it?
Yes, it is robust debate, and I want a national conversation about it. I don't step back from a very strong national debate about this, because the government has put in place a number of very important long-term reforms, carbon pricing, for example, where we've seen all manner of vested interests clothe that vested interest in their self-interest and seek to sabotage the implementation of long-term policy for the good of the country. So I'm calling for a wider debate that goes beyond a couple of billionaires, a wider debate about how we strengthen our economy for the future, how we make the most of the Asian century, how we make this the Australian century in Asia. But we can only do that if we keep the fair go, and we can only do that if everybody has the sense that we have strong social mobility. We are far more equal than many other developed economies in the world, but in many of those societies, equality is receding, social mobility is reducing. We have to be aware here that we've got to keep the essence of the fair go alive, that is high social mobility in Australia. And what that means is strong public policies which take on the vested interests who seek to distort those public policies.
But apart from funding advertising campaigns against government policies that they say they don't believe in, where is the evidence that, as you put it, these individuals are a threat to democracy?
Well, it hasn't just been there in terms of the MRRT. We've seen all manner of campaigns run by powerful self-interested interest groups who've been opposing public policy when it comes to carbon pricing. And in fact, we've seen the way in which their claims have been transmitted into the newspapers, and on many occasions without adequate scrutiny. I think there's ample evidence right across the board. I mean, you've got Mr Forrest today, given the fact that we are having this debate, suddenly taking out full-page newspaper ads. The average punter only gets to vote at the election. They might get to ring up a radio station. They don't get to take out full-page ads like Mr Forrest has taken out today. I think that proves the point.
Well, let's have a look at the ad that he published today. In it, he attempts to make the point that he pays more than $1 billion a year in taxes. He employs directly or indirectly tens of thousands of people, and that in his view, those things combined give him the right to express his opinions.
Well, he can give his opinion, but it's got a lot more force when it's backed by all of that money. The fact is, until the end of last year, Mr Forrest...
But a lot of that money comes back to the government for the benefit of the country.
Well... Well, you could excuse anything if that was the line you were going to run. The fact is, until the end of last year, he hadn't paid any company tax at all. At the same time, he had been campaigning vigorously against the mining resource rent tax. You see, this is the point I'm making. We've got good public policy. It's being opposed by powerful vested interests, and they are prepared to use all of their resources to get an outcome for them, not necessarily for the country.
Wayne Swan, you're being a bit mischievous, aren't you, when you claim that Andrew Forrest doesn't pay company tax?
No, I'm not.
Because, of course, companies like Fortescue, we all know, can claim millions in tax deductions to account for the huge sums that they invest in infrastructure for the country. And you're also overlooking the fact that he pays an enormous amount of money in payroll tax, royalties and other taxes.
Let's put it this way. Mr Forrest was conducting a campaign against a tax at a time when he was not paying company tax himself. That's point number one.
But he was paying other taxes and royalties. You'd have to concede that.
Yes, he was paying royalties, like he should have been paying royalties. But point number two...
More than $1 billion worth.
Well, that's not true, and you ought to go and have a look at the facts. The fact is that other companies who are paying...
He's paid for full-page ads today in which his company claims to be paying more than $1 billion in tax a year. Are they lying?
Well, you've just misrepresented what he was saying in the ad. But anyway, the fact is other companies out there that are paying their royalties or paying company tax aren't behaving like Mr Forrest. And that's the point that I'm making. We reached an agreement with the mining industry about a resource rent tax which we can use to give a substantial tax cut to 2.7 million small businesses, that we can use to boost the superannuation savings of millions of Australian workers. They've agreed on that. Mr Forrest and others are still out there campaigning against that tax and using their resources to do it in a way which I do think in the long run is a threat to democracy.
When you talk about these specific individuals, and let's pick up on Gina Rinehart, this is someone who is fiercely private. She's rarely seen in public, less still heard in public. What is it that she has done exactly that's so rattled you? Hasn't
done anything of the sort. She's been playing a fiercely public role. She's been spending a lot of her money conducting campaigns against carbon pricing and against resource taxation. She's buying into the media, reportedly, because she wants the media to more reflect her views. You couldn't get any more public than that.
But do you know that as a fact, that that's why she bought into Fairfax?
Well, I do. John Singleton said so in the Sydney Morning Herald. He said that she's a close mate.
Mr Swan, I put it to you that this is not so much about how much money you have, but really it's about how persuasive your arguments are. Surely you and your colleagues in the federal government have more influence over a public discussion, or should have more influence over it, than a business, no matter how big they are. If your policies are as good and as fair as you say they are, then your attack against these wealthy individuals appears more born of your own frustration that you haven't been very good at selling your government's agenda.
Well, there's a couple of points there. We could go through them all, but the fact is that millions and millions of dollars were spent in the last couple of years arguing for the self-interest of a very small number of people. That happened, number one. That is a very powerful impact. It isn't just the money they spend on advertising. It's all of the corporate manoeuvring that they do as well, and they exercise that power in boardrooms right across the country. They do that as well. And, of course, it's their influence in the media as well, and I raised those issues today. Ms Rinehart's investment, for example, in the Sydney Morning Herald, the skiting from John Singleton about how people in radio stations conduct overt and covert campaigns against the government. These factors are all there at the moment. They've been there for all Australians to see. I can tell you there's a lot of unease in the Australian community about the activities of some of these people, and I thought it was really important to start a national conversation about it. I'm not afraid of this conversation, and I want to see it go on for some time because there's a lot at stake here. We are going to be a very wealthy country in the future. It's very important that we continue to grow, but it's also very important that we continue to share fairly the bounty of this great country. That's my commitment, and that's why I'm opening this argument at the moment, because I do think it's under threat.
Do you include Rupert Murdoch among the powerful and wealthy individuals who you say are confusing their personal interest with the national interest?
Well, he's certainly very powerful in terms of his media operations, but he hasn't been out there conducting paid campaigns against the government like a number of others.
Well, the Labor Party has for some time been famously at war with News Limited. Don't you believe that at least in part the owners of those newspapers are trying to wield influence over government policy?
No, what I can say is I do What I can say is I do believe there are one or two news publications which have been very unfair in their treatment of the government. I've said that publicly before, and that is part and parcel of the debate that we ought to have. We ought to have a debate about the degree to which there is fairness in the media, that the coverage is balanced and so on. I've made those points before. None of those are new. But I am making the point here very specifically about the activities of a couple of people who have sought to distort public policy in their own self-interest. I've called it for what it is. I don't apologise for that. And I can tell you from talking to Australians in recent times that there's a lot that agree with me.
What about James Packer, who's reportedly managed to have secret meetings with the Prime Minister over pokey reforms? Isn't that evidence that he's exerting influence on government decision-making?
I think what you are confusing here, I'm not sure that that's true either, but what you are confusing here is the way in which business will legitimately go about putting their case to government. They do it across the board, they've always done it, and that's important that we listen to the business community. They play a very important role in our economy. And my comments aren't about the general business community at all. 99% of them want to do the right thing by the country, believe in the notion of a fair go, and are great wealth creators for our country. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something new, and I think something that is quite insidious, and that is the rise of a group of individuals who are prepared to use enormous amounts of wealth to distort a public purpose openly and in full confrontation with the government. That might be their right, but I think the Australian people ought to know what's going on.
You say that politicians have the choice between standing up for workers and kneeling down at the feet of the Gina Rineharts and the Clive Palmers. And yet you rolled over when the vested interests in the gaming sector didn't want mandatory pre-commitment technology on poker machines.
We have just got the biggest poker machine reform in our history coming to the Parliament. It's a very, very substantial package. Nothing like this has ever been attempted before, just like we put through the Parliament carbon pricing in the face of very strong opposition from vested interests. We're a government that looks after the national interest. We're prepared to have a fight about ideas. We're prepared to have a fight about principles. We've shown that in the past 18 months, and we'll keep doing what's right. And that package that we've got coming through is a very important one for Australia.
Well, didn't that show then that you did, to use your words, kneel down at the feet of vested interests in the pokies debate?
Well, I don't know where you've been. They've already been running that campaign in marginal seats. Emma, you could have come to my seat at any stage in the last 4 or 5 months and seen that campaign in full swing. The fact is we have got a very substantial package of reforms in terms of poker machines, which will be of great benefit to this country.
In the same vein of capitulating to vested interests with deep pockets, isn't it a little ironic that 2 weeks after the mining industry staged a rally that your party dumped Kevin Rudd, who'd campaigned for a much more aggressive mining tax, and that you now end up with a severely watered down version that economists say will rob the government of something like $10 billion annually in revenue?
No, it doesn't show that at all. It shows that we can get through the Parliament a package of very substantial reforms, and given the opposition that has been out there, that's a very formidable achievement for our government.
A number of economists are saying that. Are you now saying that yours is not a watered-down version of the original mining tax?
Well, that's just all rubbish and completely untrue. It's got no basis in fact.
So you're now saying that the mining tax to be levied later this year is as aggressive as it was in its previous incarnation?
It's a different tax based on different principles that raises a similar amount of money. All of those calculations which go out for 10 years are not soundly based at all. It's yet another example of a lot of that stuff that gets into the media and is exaggerated and isn't subject to the serious scrutiny it ought to be.
Now, Wayne Swan, over the weekend you were described as the most left-leaning treasurer since Jim Cairns. How does that sit with you?
Yeah. Oh, that was hilarious. I mean, I'm so left-wing that I've been endorsed by the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, Euro Money magazine. You know, I'm that left-wing. I'm in great company. It just goes to show that people are not reading the article. The fact that that is in an editorial of a major national newspaper just shows they haven't read the article. I go to great lengths in the article to point out that business plays a really important role in our society. You see, this whole debate was kicked off in the Financial Times in London, who ran a whole series about capitalism in crisis and how the disappearance of the middle class was threatening capitalism. The fact is, fairness in a society is very important, not just for social reasons, but for economic reasons as well.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is that if a fairer society has got a chance of just not being a harmonious society, it's got a chance of being one which invests in the education and the training of its people. When it does that, it's a far stronger economy that comes out the other end. If you have a shrinking middle class with shrinking consumption that doesn't invest in education and training and health systems, they're not good economies. They're bad societies, but not good economies.
You might have been named the world's best treasurer, but Clive Palmer has now been recognised as just one of 100 national treasures.
Yes, oh well, good on him.
Well, what did you think of that?
Oh, well, each to their own. I thought it was pretty puzzling myself, but, I'm not going to have a go at him about that. I want to talk about the substance of the issues, and we've been doing that tonight.
OK, Wayne Swan, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.